Sometimes fate does not knock on your door. Sometimes it quietly recognizes a mark you forgot you were carrying. The crisp October air drifted through Maple Grove Community Park as families gathered beneath rows of orange and crimson trees for the town's annual Harvest Festival. Children raced through hay mazes, musicians played familiar country songs from a small wooden stage, and the comforting scent of cinnamon, fresh apple pie, and roasted corn floated through the afternoon sunlight. Nathan Brooks adjusted the sleeve of his faded flannel shirt before tightening the laces on his work boots. At 39 years old, life had left gentle lines around his blue eyes, but it had never taken away the calm kindness that defined him. Owning a small auto repair garage did not make him wealthy, yet it had given him something he valued far more. It allowed him to be home every evening when his 8-year-old daughter needed him. Sophie skipped beside him with a caramel apple in one hand and a small stuffed fox tucked beneath the other arm. "Daddy, can we see the pumpkin contest before the music starts?" Nathan smiled. "Only if we stop for hot cider first." Sophie laughed. "That is the easiest deal ever." They wandered together through the cheerful crowd, greeting neighbors who knew Nathan as the mechanic who never overcharged anyone and always stayed late if someone needed help getting home. He accepted every greeting with the same quiet humility, never imagining that this ordinary Saturday would become the day his past quietly walked back into his life. Across the festival grounds, Emily Carter stepped out of a volunteer medical tent after finishing a routine health demonstration for local families. At 35, she carried herself with the calm confidence of an experienced emergency physician. Her long blonde hair rested neatly over a navy jacket, and the warmth in her blue eyes contrasted with the quiet loneliness she had learned to hide from the world. She accepted a cup of coffee from another volunteer before beginning the short walk toward the artisan booths. Then she saw them. A little girl laughing as she chased colorful leaves across the grass. A father smiling with peaceful pride only a devoted parent could understand. Emily paused without knowing why. Something about the man's posture, the gentle way he watched his daughter, awakened a memory that had remained buried for years. Before she could understand the feeling, a marching band turned the corner, filling the pathway with performers and curious spectators. The cheerful crowd suddenly shifted in every direction. Sophie looked back for only a second before disappearing behind a wave of moving people nearly twice her height. "Daddy," she called, her small voice swallowed by music and applause. Nathan's smile vanished instantly, though he refused to panic. He moved carefully through the crowd, calling her name with calm urgency. "Sophie! Stay where you are." A few yards away, Emily noticed the frightened little girl standing alone near the edge of the walkway. Without hesitation, she knelt beside her. "Hey there," she said gently. "Are you looking for someone?" Sophie's eyes shimmered with worry, but she nodded bravely. "My daddy." Emily offered a reassuring smile and softly held out her hand. "Then let us find him together." Only seconds later, Nathan reached them, breathing hard from searching through the crowd. Relief flooded his face the moment he saw Sophie safe. She rushed into his arms while he wrapped her in the steady embrace she knew would always be waiting. "I have got you," he whispered. "I will always find you." Emily quietly watched the reunion, feeling an unexpected ache in her heart. Nathan stood and turned toward her with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for helping my daughter." Their eyes met for the first time. Nathan saw only a kind stranger who had helped when his family needed it most. Emily, however, felt the world grow strangely still as her gaze drifted toward the faded lighthouse tattoo peeking from beneath the rolled sleeve of Nathan's left arm, and for one impossible heartbeat, it was as though 13 years had never passed at all. Emily Carter could not look away. The faded lighthouse tattoo resting just above Nathan Brooks's wrist pulled her back through 13 years of memories she had spent countless nights trying to convince herself had belonged to someone else. Around them, the Harvest Festival continued with cheerful laughter, live music, and children racing through piles of colorful autumn leaves, yet every sound seemed to drift farther away until only one question remained inside her heart. Could it really be him? Nathan gently brushed a few strands of hair away from Sophie's face before smiling gratefully at Emily once again. "Thank you," he said warmly. You probably saved me from the longest 5 minutes of my life. Emily returned his smile, though it carried emotions she struggled to hide. She was very brave. She never stopped believing you would find her. Sophie beamed proudly. Daddy always comes back. Nathan laughed softly. That is the deal we made a long time ago. Emily lowered her eyes for just a moment. The simple sentence landed with unexpected weight because years earlier another young man had made a promise about always finding his way back. She had never forgotten it. Nathan noticed her thoughtful expression. Are you all right? Emily quickly nodded. Yes. I was just thinking how lucky your daughter is. Nathan looked toward Sophie with quiet affection. Truthfully, I think I am the lucky one. Sophie tugged gently on Nathan's sleeve. Daddy, can we still see the pumpkin contest? He smiled. Of course. Before leaving, Nathan turned back toward Emily. Would you like to join us? It is the least we can do after everything. Emily hesitated. Every sensible part of her mind told her to politely decline and walk away before old memories clouded her judgment. But something stronger quietly answered for her. I would like that. The three of them walked together beneath strings of hanging lights stretched between maple trees glowing with orange and red leaves. Festival vendors greeted families with friendly smiles while the aroma of fresh cinnamon donuts mixed with cool autumn air. Sophie chatted excitedly about school, her favorite books, and the stray kitten she hoped her father would eventually let her adopt. Emily listened more than she spoke, quietly observing the gentle rhythm between father and daughter. Nathan never interrupted Sophie. He listened carefully to every story as though each word mattered. Emily realized she had rarely witnessed that kind of patient attention, even among families who seemed to have everything. They stopped beside the pumpkin display where enormous orange pumpkins sat in neat rows waiting for the judges. Sophie wandered a few feet away to admire one shaped almost perfectly like a heart. Nathan folded his arms comfortably before speaking. You mentioned you were volunteering today. Are you a nurse? Emily smiled. Close. I work as an emergency physician at St. Andrew Medical Center. Nathan nodded with genuine respect. That must take a special kind of person. Emily answered quietly. Sometimes it just takes someone willing to stay when life becomes difficult. Nathan smiled without realizing how deeply those words echoed through her memories. As a cool breeze drifted across the festival grounds, he rolled his sleeves a little higher, revealing more of the lighthouse tattoo that time had softened but never erased. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. Every tiny detail matched the image she had carried in her memory for over a decade. The shape of the lighthouse. The weathered ink near the waves. Even the tiny star above the tower. She had seen that tattoo only once before, under bright hospital lights on a night that had changed her life forever. Nathan noticed her eyes lingering on his arm and chuckled politely. Most people think it was a bad decision I made in my 20s. Emily slowly lifted her gaze to meet his. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, yet every word carried the weight of years. No, she said softly. I remember that lighthouse. Nathan Brooks stared at Emily Carter with quiet confusion, searching her face for an answer hidden somewhere behind her gentle smile. Around them, children laughed as they climbed stacks of hay bales, a bluegrass band played another familiar tune from the wooden stage, and autumn leaves drifted lazily through the cool afternoon air, yet everything beyond Emily's last sentence seemed strangely distant. Nathan glanced down at the lighthouse tattoo on his left wrist before looking back at her. You remember it? He asked with a polite laugh. That would be difficult. I had this done almost 15 years ago. Emily nodded slowly, her blue eyes never leaving the faded ink. I know. Nathan tilted his head slightly. Have we met before? Emily opened her mouth to answer, but the words refused to come. She had imagined this moment countless times over the years, wondering what she would say if fate ever placed them together again. Now that it had finally happened, every carefully rehearsed sentence seemed far too small for everything she carried inside her heart. Sophie looked curiously from one adult to the other. Daddy, is Miss Emily one of your old friends? Nathan smiled apologetically. I honestly do not know. Emily lowered her eyes for a brief moment before speaking with careful honesty. I am not sure you would remember me. Nathan frowned gently. That sounds like there is a story. Emily gave a quiet smile that carried more sadness than joy. Maybe there is. A comfortable silence settled between them as the afternoon breeze rustled the colorful maple leaves overhead. Nathan had always believed silence could reveal more about a person than endless conversation. Emily did not seem uncomfortable. She simply seemed to be protecting something fragile. Sophie tugged lightly on Nathan's hand. Daddy, I am going to look at the scarecrows. Nathan nodded. Do not go farther than the fence. I promise. The little girl skipped away, leaving the two adults standing beneath the branches of an old oak tree. Nathan folded his arms comfortably. If we have met before, I am sorry I do not remember. Emily looked toward the festival for a long moment before quietly answering. 13 years ago I was a first-year emergency physician. A young man was brought into our hospital after a terrible storm. He had injuries, mild memory loss, and one thing that stayed perfectly clear in my mind. Her eyes returned to the lighthouse tattoo. Nathan's expression softened, though confusion still filled his face. I was in an accident years ago, he admitted. The doctors said I could not remember several days afterward. Emily slowly nodded. I know. Nathan searched his memory, but all he found were scattered fragments that never seemed to connect. The sound of rain against glass. Bright hospital lights. Someone reading quietly beside his bed. A warm voice telling him everything would be all right. They were memories without faces, pieces of a puzzle that had never been completed. Were you there? He asked softly. Emily took a slow breath. Every day. Nathan blinked, surprised by the certainty in her answer. Then why do I not remember you? Emily smiled sadly. Because memory is not always the first thing the heart holds on to. Before Nathan could respond, his cell phone vibrated inside his pocket. He glanced at the screen and saw the garage calling. One of his mechanics needed help with an unexpected repair before closing time. Nathan answered briefly, promised he would return within the hour, then slipped the phone back into his pocket with an apologetic expression. I have to get back to work. Emily nodded with complete understanding. Of course. Nathan hesitated before speaking again. Would you, maybe have coffee with me sometime? I have a feeling this conversation should not end here. Emily's smile grew warmer than it had been all afternoon. I was hoping you would ask. As Sophie came running back toward them holding a blue ribbon she had won for decorating a miniature pumpkin, neither Nathan nor Emily noticed a man standing across the festival grounds near the parking lot, watching them from a distance with quiet concern, his expression changing the moment he recognized Emily talking to the one person he had spent years hoping she would never meet again. The late afternoon sun settled lower over Maple Grove as Nathan Brooks watched Emily Carter walk toward the parking lot before disappearing behind rows of colorful maple trees. For reasons he could not explain, he remained standing beneath the old oak tree several seconds longer than necessary, his fingers unconsciously brushing across the faded lighthouse tattoo on his wrist. The strange familiarity in Emily's voice refused to leave his thoughts. Sophie gently slipped her hand into his. Daddy? He smiled and looked down. Yes, sweetheart? She tilted her head thoughtfully. Miss Emily looked like she already knew you. Nathan laughed quietly, though uncertainty lingered behind his eyes. Maybe she knew someone who looked like me. Sophie accepted the answer with the simple trust only a child could possess. I hope we see her again. Nathan squeezed her hand. Maybe we will. Nearly 30 minutes later he arrived back at Brooks Auto Repair, a modest neighborhood garage that smelled of motor oil, fresh rubber, and honest work. The familiar sound of air tools and country music drifting from an old radio welcomed him home in a way expensive offices never could. His longtime employee, Mike Dawson, waved from beneath the hood of a pickup truck. Glad you made it back. Mrs. Henderson's SUV needed a last-minute alternator. Nathan nodded, immediately pulling on a pair of worn work gloves. Let us get her back on the road before dinner. For the next 2 hours he worked with the quiet focus that had earned the trust of nearly every family in town. Customers greeted him by name. Children waiting with their parents wandered into the small office where free coloring books sat beside fresh coffee and homemade cookies left each Friday by an elderly neighbor. Nathan believed fixing cars was never only about engines. Sometimes it was about helping people make it home. Across town, Emily sat alone in her office at St. Andrew Medical Center after her evening shift had ended. The emergency department had finally grown quiet, leaving only the soft hum of hallway lights and distant footsteps echoing through nearly empty corridors. She opened the top drawer of her desk and carefully removed an old leather notebook that had traveled with her through every move, every promotion, and every difficult year. Between its pages rested a faded photograph taken 13 years earlier. It showed a young hospital patient asleep beside a window while a storm raged outside. His face was partially turned away, but the lighthouse tattoo on his wrist was unmistakable. Emily gently touched the photograph before closing her eyes. I finally found you, she whispered. A quiet knock interrupted the silence. Daniel Pierce stepped into the office carrying 2 cups of coffee. At 40 years old, he remained polished and confident in the dark blue suit he wore almost every day as legal counsel for the hospital. Long shift? He asked with an easy smile. Emily quickly closed the notebook. It has been an interesting day. Daniel placed 1 cup on her desk before noticing the notebook resting beneath her hand. His smile faded almost imperceptibly. You are looking through old memories again. Emily nodded. Sometimes life surprises you. Daniel studied her expression carefully. Did something happen at the festival? Emily hesitated only briefly before answering truthfully. I met someone I never expected to see again. For the first time that evening, genuine concern crossed Daniel's face. He remained silent, but his thoughts raced toward a secret he had guarded for more than a decade. As Emily looked out through the hospital window toward the first stars appearing above the town, Daniel quietly realized that the past he had worked so hard to keep buried had just begun finding its way back into the light. 3 evenings later, a gentle rain settled over Maple Grove, turning the sidewalks into ribbons of reflected streetlights as Nathan Brooks locked the front door of his repair garage. He wiped the last traces of grease from his hands before climbing into his aging pickup truck, but instead of driving home immediately, he found himself looking at the small paper coffee cup resting on the passenger seat. Earlier that afternoon, Emily Carter had called exactly when she promised she would. Her voice had been calm, almost hesitant, as they agreed to meet at a quiet neighborhood cafe overlooking the river after her hospital shift ended. Nathan smiled to himself, surprised by how much he had been looking forward to the conversation. Across town, Emily removed her white physician's coat and folded it neatly inside her office locker before slipping into a simple navy sweater beneath a light beige jacket. She looked at herself briefly in the mirror, not to impress anyone, but to steady the emotions she had carried since the Harvest Festival. For 13 years she had imagined explaining the truth if she ever found Nathan again. Now every possible beginning sounded incomplete. She quietly whispered to her reflection, just tell him the truth. 20 minutes later they sat across from one another inside the small cafe where warm yellow lights reflected across polished wooden tables while soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows, wrapping the evening in peaceful silence. Nathan wrapped both hands around a mug of fresh coffee before smiling warmly. I appreciate you meeting me. Emily returned the smile. Thank you for asking. For a few minutes they spoke about ordinary things. Nathan described life at the repair garage and Sophie's growing collection of library books. Emily shared stories about encouraging young medical residents and the satisfaction of helping frightened patients feel less alone. Conversation came surprisingly easily, as though 2 strangers had somehow skipped past the awkwardness that usually accompanies a first meeting. Finally Nathan glanced down at the lighthouse tattoo on his wrist before looking back at Emily. You said you remembered this. Emily nodded slowly. I remember more than the tattoo. Nathan waited patiently, never interrupting. She took a careful breath. 13 years ago, after that storm, you arrived at St. Andrew Medical Center with temporary memory loss. I was assigned to your care during my first month as a resident physician. You stayed for several days. Nathan listened quietly. As Emily spoke, faint images began drifting through his thoughts. A hospital room filled with soft morning light. Someone reading aloud from a worn paperback novel. The scent of fresh coffee. A gentle voice reminding him that healing required patience. He pressed his fingers lightly against the side of his mug. I remember pieces, he admitted softly. Not faces. Just feelings. Emily's eyes filled with quiet emotion. You used to watch the rain through your hospital window every evening. One night you told me the lighthouse tattoo reminded you that no matter how dark the water became, there was always something worth finding your way home for. Nathan closed his eyes for a brief moment. The words sounded strangely familiar, as though they had been waiting somewhere deep inside his heart all along. Before either of them could continue, the bell above the cafe door chimed gently. Daniel Pierce stepped inside, stopping almost immediately when he saw the two of them sitting together. His confident expression faltered for only an instant before he composed himself and walked toward their table with polite professionalism. Emily, he said evenly, I did not expect to see you here. Nathan stood courteously and extended his hand. Nathan Brooks. Daniel accepted the handshake, though his smile never fully reached his eyes. Daniel Pierce. As their hands met, Daniel quietly realized that the man standing before him was no longer simply a forgotten patient from years ago. He was becoming the one person capable of uncovering a truth that had remained hidden far longer than anyone had ever intended. The rain had stopped by the time Daniel Pierce quietly excused himself from the cafe, leaving behind only the soft chime of the closing door and a silence that felt heavier than before. Nathan Brooks watched him disappear through the misty street outside before turning back toward Emily Carter. Do you know him well? He asked gently. Emily wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, searching for the right words. Long enough to know he has always believed some truths are better left buried. Nathan frowned slightly but did not press further. He had learned years ago that trust grew best when people were allowed to speak at their own pace. Instead, he smiled softly. Then we do not have to rush tonight. Emily looked at him with quiet gratitude. Thank you. They remained at the cafe until the last customers had gone home, talking about everything except the questions that frightened them most. Nathan shared stories about teaching Sophie how to ride a bicycle in the empty church parking lot on Saturday mornings. Emily laughed when he admitted they both fell more than once before finally getting it right. She told him about a young patient who insisted every bandage should come with a dinosaur sticker because bravery deserved a reward. Their conversation flowed with surprising ease, as though years of silence had simply been waiting for one peaceful evening to disappear. Before leaving, Emily reached into her handbag and carefully placed a small folded piece of paper on the table. There is something I think belongs to you. Nathan unfolded it slowly. Inside was a faded hospital visitor pass dated 13 years earlier. His own name appeared across the top in black ink, and beneath it, written in neat handwriting, were 4 simple words. Keep looking for tomorrow. Nathan stared at the note, and another fragment of memory quietly returned. He remembered waking during a thunderstorm, frightened by the emptiness inside his own mind. Someone had placed that note beside his bed before leaving for the night shift. Someone had smiled and promised that memories sometimes returned one gentle step at a time. Nathan looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. You wrote this. Emily nodded, tears quietly gathering in her eyes. You kept reading it every morning because it was the only thing you recognized. Nathan carefully folded the paper again, treating it like something far more valuable than old ink on worn cardstock. I do not remember your face, he admitted honestly, but I remember how safe I felt. Emily closed her eyes for just a moment. That single sentence healed a wound she had carried for over a decade. Outside, they walked together beneath clear skies where the rain had left every street shining beneath the lamps. Before they reached their cars, Nathan stopped beside the river railing. "Would you come to dinner tomorrow?" he asked. "Nothing fancy. Sophie has already decided you make conversations better." Emily laughed through quiet emotion. "I would love that." As she drove away, Daniel remained seated alone inside his parked car across the street, watching the taillights disappear into the night. He slowly opened an old manila envelope resting on the passenger seat. Inside were several unopened letters addressed to Nathan Brooks in Emily's handwriting, each one carefully preserved for 13 years. Daniel lowered his head, finally accepting the weight of his own choices. He had once convinced himself that separating two strangers would protect everyone from disappointment. Now, as he looked at the faded envelopes resting in his hands, he realized he had never separated strangers at all. He had only delayed two good people from finding the road that had always been leading them quietly back to each other. The following evening, the comforting aroma of homemade chicken soup drifted through Nathan Brooks's small house as golden sunset light spilled across the hardwood floor. Sophie hurried between the kitchen and dining table, carefully placing mismatched plates exactly where she thought they belonged. "Daddy," she whispered excitedly, "do you think Miss Emily likes blueberry pie?" Nathan smiled while setting fresh bread onto the table. "I guess we are about to find out." A gentle knock sounded at the front door. Sophie raced ahead before Nathan could reach it. When the door opened, Emily Carter stood on the porch carrying a small basket filled with fresh apples from a nearby orchard and a bouquet of autumn flowers wrapped in brown paper. She smiled warmly. "I hope I am not too early." Sophie immediately shook her head. "You are exactly on time." Nathan welcomed her inside with the same quiet kindness that had slowly become familiar to Emily. The little house was simple but filled with warmth. Family photographs rested on shelves beside well-worn novels. The old upright piano stood near the living room window where soft evening light reflected across its faded wooden surface. Emily looked around with quiet admiration. "Your home feels peaceful." Nathan smiled. "It is not perfect, but it has always been enough for us." Dinner passed with easy conversation and gentle laughter. Sophie proudly described her latest science project while Emily listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that made the little girl beam with confidence. Nathan noticed how naturally Emily encouraged Sophie, never speaking down to her, always treating her ideas as important. After the meal, Sophie climbed onto the old piano bench. "Would you like to hear the song I learned?" Emily nodded. "I would love that." Small fingers carefully found each note while Nathan stood quietly beside the piano, smiling every time Sophie corrected herself without becoming discouraged. Emily watched them together, realizing that this gentle rhythm of patience and encouragement had probably shaped every part of Sophie's kind heart. When the final note faded, Sophie looked hopefully toward Emily. "Did I do okay?" Emily smiled with tears quietly forming in her eyes. "You played with your whole heart. That always matters more than perfection." Sophie happily ran upstairs to bring down one of her sketchbooks, leaving Nathan and Emily alone in the living room for a few peaceful moments. Nathan gently unfolded the faded hospital visitor pass she had given him the night before. "I kept thinking about this all day," he admitted. "More memories are starting to return." Emily looked at him quietly. "What do you remember?" Nathan stared toward the window where the first evening stars had begun appearing above the neighborhood. "I remember someone reading to me while rain hit the hospital window. I remember hearing laughter when I told terrible jokes. And I remember promising someone that after I recovered, I would take her to see a lighthouse on the coast." Emily covered her mouth as emotion filled her eyes. "You really said that?" Nathan turned toward her. "Did we ever make that trip?" Emily slowly shook her head. "No." Before either of them could speak again, a car quietly stopped outside the house. Through the front window, Nathan saw Daniel Pierce walking slowly toward the porch carrying the same manila envelope he had guarded the previous evening. His shoulders seemed heavier than before, and his confident expression had disappeared completely. Nathan opened the front door before Daniel even reached the steps. Daniel stopped, looked first at Nathan, then at Emily standing quietly behind him, and finally lowered his eyes toward the envelope in his hands. His voice was calm but filled with unmistakable regret. "I cannot change the last 13 years, he said softly. "But I can finally tell both of you the truth that should have been yours from the very beginning." Daniel Pierce remained standing on the front porch, the manila envelope resting quietly in his hands as though it weighed far more than a few sheets of paper. Nathan Brooks stepped aside without saying a word. "Come in," he said calmly. There was no anger in his voice, only the quiet dignity that had guided every difficult moment of his life. Emily Carter stood near the living room window, her heart pounding as Daniel slowly entered the house she had begun to associate with peace instead of regret. Upstairs, Sophie continued humming softly while organizing her sketchbooks, unaware that the adults below were about to reopen a chapter that had remained closed for 13 years. Daniel carefully placed the envelope on the dining table before looking at both of them. "I have replayed this conversation in my mind more times than I can count," he admitted. "Every year it became harder to tell the truth." Nathan folded his hands together and waited. Emily quietly nodded, encouraging him to continue. Daniel opened the envelope and removed several carefully preserved letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting on every envelope belonged to Emily. Nathan recognized it immediately from the note she had once left beside his hospital bed. Daniel lowered his eyes. "You wrote these after Nathan left the hospital." "One letter every week for nearly 4 months." Emily stared in disbelief. "They were all returned to me." Daniel slowly shook his head. "No. They never left my office." Silence settled over the room. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the front yard while the evening breeze gently stirred the branches of the maple tree beside the porch. Nathan looked down at the unopened letters without touching them. "Why?" he asked softly. Daniel took a slow breath. "At the time I believed you were beginning a life that would only end in disappointment." Nathan had no memory of those days. "You were exhausted, overwhelmed, and willing to wait for someone who might never remember you. I convinced myself I was protecting you from more pain." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "You made that decision for both of us." Daniel nodded once. "I did. And I was wrong." Nathan finally reached for the ribbon and untied it with careful hands. He opened the first letter. Inside, Emily had written about hoping his memories would return, about praying his future would be brighter than the storm that had brought him into her hospital, and about believing some people entered our lives for a reason even when the ending remained uncertain. Nathan quietly read another letter, then another. None of them asked for anything. None of them demanded an answer. They simply offered hope. He closed the final envelope and looked at Emily. "You never stopped believing." Emily smiled through quiet tears. "I never knew where to send my heart after those letters disappeared." Daniel stepped back toward the front door. "I do not expect forgiveness tonight." Nathan gently placed the letters back inside the envelope before meeting Daniel's eyes. "You stole years from both of us." Daniel lowered his head. Nathan continued in the same calm voice. "But carrying bitterness will not give those years back." Emily looked at Nathan with quiet admiration. Once again, he had chosen grace instead of resentment. Daniel's eyes filled with emotion. "I am truly sorry." Nathan walked toward him and gently placed the envelope back into Daniel's hands. "Keep it until tomorrow. I want Sophie to meet the man who finally chose honesty." Daniel looked confused. Nathan smiled faintly. "Everyone deserves a second chance when they finally tell the truth." Daniel stood speechless as Emily quietly slipped her hand into Nathan's. For the first time in 13 years, none of them felt trapped by the past. The silence filling the little house no longer carried regret. It carried the unmistakable sound of healing finally finding its way home. 1 year later, the first light of autumn spread across the Atlantic coastline as gentle waves rolled toward the quiet beach outside the old lighthouse Nathan Brooks had spoken about so many years before. The white tower stood proudly against the pale blue sky, its lantern still turning with patient rhythm, reminding every traveler that even the longest nights eventually welcomed morning. Nathan walked slowly across the sand beside Sophie, who carried a small woven basket filled with seashells she had collected since sunrise. Emily Carter followed a few steps behind, smiling as the cool ocean breeze lifted strands of her blonde hair. The three of them had come to this place not to remember what they had lost, but to celebrate everything they had finally found. Nathan stopped near the base of the lighthouse and quietly rolled up the sleeve of his flannel shirt, revealing the familiar lighthouse tattoo that had unknowingly guided two lives back together after 13 years apart. Emily gently traced the air above the faded ink without touching it. "It looks exactly the way I remembered," she whispered. Nathan smiled softly. "It finally means what I always hoped it would." Sophie looked curiously at both of them. "What does it mean?" Nathan knelt beside his daughter, drawing a small circle in the sand with one finger. "A lighthouse does not move the ships. It simply keeps shining until they find their own way home." Sophie nodded thoughtfully before slipping her small hand into Emily's. "I think you were Daddy's lighthouse." Emily's eyes filled with quiet tears as she gently squeezed the little girl's hand. "And I think your father became mine." They climbed the winding staircase together until they reached the observation deck overlooking miles of peaceful ocean. The view stretched endlessly beneath the warm morning sun, the water sparkling like scattered glass while gulls drifted effortlessly through the gentle breeze. Nathan looked toward the horizon before turning to Emily. "For years I believed those missing memories had stolen part of my life." He paused with a quiet smile. "Now I understand they only delayed the moment I was meant to appreciate the most." Emily reached into her jacket pocket and carefully removed the first unopened letter Daniel had finally returned. Time had faded the paper, but the words inside had never lost their meaning. Nathan unfolded it once more before reading the final sentence aloud. "Some people find each other quickly. Others simply take the longer road home." He folded the letter again and looked at Emily with calm certainty. "Would you keep taking that road with Sophie and me?" Emily laughed softly through grateful tears. "Every single day." Sophie clapped happily before wrapping her arms around both of them at once. The three remained standing together as the lighthouse lantern slowly completed another graceful turn above their heads. Down below, Daniel walked quietly along the shoreline with his wife and young son, having rebuilt his own life through honesty and service to others. When he noticed the family standing high above the sea, he stopped for only a moment and smiled with peaceful acceptance before continuing his walk without interrupting them. Nathan watched him disappear into the distance and quietly whispered, "Grace does not erase yesterday. It simply gives tomorrow a chance." Emily rested her head gently against Nathan's shoulder while Sophie laughed as another wave chased her footprints across the sand below. The lighthouse continued shining exactly as it always had, asking for nothing in return, reminding anyone willing to look that dignity never needs to raise its voice, forgiveness always travels farther than resentment, and the greatest miracles are often not found in extraordinary moments, but in ordinary people who choose kindness until life finally leads them home.